Upward nail mark orientation, pushing versus pulling biomechanics. A forensic pathology analysis of defensive mechanism, identification, hand position mechanics, and what mark direction reveals about struggle duration and perpetrator control. Part 1. The mark orientation finding, directional significance. Autopsy findings document a specific pattern of abrasion on JonBenet's neck. This roughly triangular, parchment-like rust-colored abrasion, which measures 1.5 inches in length with a maximum width of 0.75 inches. This roughly triangular shaped abrasion is obliquely oriented with the apex superior and lateral. This description contains critical forensic information. The abrasion is obliquely oriented with the apex superior. The point of the triangular mark points upward, toward the jaw and the upper neck. This directional orientation is biomechanically significant and reveals information about 1. The type of defensive attempt, pulling versus pushing. 2. The hand position and grip during the attack. 3. The nature and duration of resistance. 4. The perpetrator's control over the victim. POW. Biomechanics of fingernail marks. Mechanics of injury. Understanding the significance of the upward-pointing nail mark requires examination of how fingernail marks are created during ligature asphyxiation. Fingernail mark creation mechanism. When a ligature is placed around the neck and tightened, a victim under conscious pressure typically attempts to remove or dislodge the ligature. This defensive response involves attempting to get fingers or hands under the ligature to relieve pressure. 2 primary defensive hand positioning patterns. Pattern 1. Pulling hooking defense. Victim attempts to grasp the ligature with fingers. Fingers hook upward and inward to get under the cord. Fingernails dig into the skin, trying to create space beneath the ligature. Hand position. Fingers curled upward, attempting to lift. Pull the cord away from neck. Nail mark direction. Would point downward or laterally. Fingers pulling upward and outward. This pattern indicates active resistance and extended struggle. Pattern 2. Pushing defense. Victim presses hands or palm against the ligature, attempting to push the cord away from the neck by direct pressure. This is typically a less successful defensive mechanism. Hand position. Open hand or palm, pressing laterally against the ligature. Nail mark direction varies based on palm position. This pattern is less effective for sustained resistance. Pattern 3. Upward scratching or gouging. Victim attempts to scratch at the ligature from below. Fingers move upward along the neck ligature intersection, creating scratches or abrasions with apex superior, pointing upward. Hand position. Fingers below the ligature attempting to gouge, scratch upward. Nail mark direction. Points upward toward jaw. This pattern indicates victim attempting to dig fingernails into the space above the ligature. Part 3. The apex. Superior orientation. What it indicates. The autopsy finding of a triangular abrasion with apex superior and lateral is forensically significant because it indicates the direction of the defensive force. Interpretation of apex superior orientation. An abrasion with the apex pointing upward toward the jaw indicates the defensive mechanism involved. Fingernails being drawn upward along the neck. Fingers positioned below the ligature attempting to gouge or pry upward. Defensive force directed upward against the underside of the ligature. Why this orientation matters. This orientation suggests the victim was attempting to create space under the ligature. Pythagoras 1. Positioning fingers below the cord. Applying upward pressure with fingernails. 3. Attempting to scratch or gouge at the underside of the ligature. 4. Trying to lift or separate the cord from the neck. This is consistent with a defensive response to an already tightened garrote, attempting to get fingers underneath the cord to relieve the pressure. Part 4. The tight cord problem. Inability to insert fingers. A critical forensic finding complicates understanding of this mark. The ligature around JonBenet's neck was described as creating a deep ligature furrow that encircles the entire neck. The furrow was noted to be extremely tight, with dimensions of 1/8 to 5/16 of an inch wide. The forensic problem: if the garrote was pulled tight enough to create such a deep, pronounced furrow, it would be extremely difficult, potentially impossible, for a victim to insert fingers underneath the ligature to perform the gouging or upward scratching defensive motion that would create an upward-pointing nail mark. Anatomical constraint analysis. For a victim to create fingernail marks with apex superior orientation, the victim would need to 1. Get fingers between the ligature and the neck skin. 2. Apply pressure in an upward direction, so drag the fingernails upward while the fingernails under the cord. If the cord was pulled tight enough to create a deep furrow, there would be minimal space for inserting fingers underneath the cord. The logical problem: the presence of upward-pointing nail marks suggests a victim actively attempting to get under a tightened cord. Yet the tightness of the cord, as evidenced by the deep furrow, would make this nearly impossible. This creates an investigative question. Did the mark occur during an earlier, less tight phase of the ligature attack? Or does the mark indicate something other than the victim attempting to dislodge the cord? Part 5. Mark characteristics and timing. Ante-mortem vis perimortem. A critical forensic distinction concerns when the mark was created. Ante-mortem marks. Marks created while the victim was alive, with full circulation and bleeding response. These would show reddening of the tissue, petechial hemorrhage, small blood vessel ruptures indicating bleeding, inflammation and tissue reaction. Parchment, like rust-colored appearance, indicates drying of abraded tissue. The autopsy description. The triangular abrasion was described as parchment-like, rust-colored, indicating the tissue had dried, a characteristic of ante-mortem marks that were created while the victim had active circulation and bleeding response. Implication: the nail mark was created while JonBenet was alive and actively defending. It represents a genuine defensive response during the attack, not post-mortem artifact. Part 6. Thumb-dominant pressure versus finger hooking. Defensive mechanics. The difference between defensive patterns reveals important information about the struggle's nature. Thumb-dominant pushing pressure. Victim would use palm and thumb to push laterally against the ligature, attempting to create space by pushing the cord outward and sideways. Less likely to create upward-pointing nail marks. Would create more lateral or downward-pointing marks, if any, indicates simpler. More desperate pressure application, finger hooking upward pulling. Victim would curl fingers upward and inward to get under the cord. Attempting to lift and pull the cord away from the neck would create upward and inward pointing marks. Indicates more sophisticated, sustained defensive attempt. Suggests victim trying to hook fingers to create leverage. The apex superior finding. The upward-pointing mark orientation is more consistent with finger-hooking defensive mechanics than with thumb pushing. The victim was attempting to get fingers under the cord and pull hook upward, not simply pushing laterally. This suggests the victim was making a deliberate, directed attempt to dislodge the ligature by creating space underneath it. Part 7. Brief struggle before rapid incapacitation. The temporal problem. The presence of a single defensive mark with limited evidence of extended struggle creates a forensic paradox. The autopsy findings. One major neck injury mark. The garrote, furrow with deep compression. One triangular abrasion mark with apex superior. Limited additional evidence of struggled defensive injuries. Minimal extensive scratching or multiple defensive marks. Body position found with hands overhead. not in active defensive posture. Interpretation. The presence of evidence of some defensive attempt, the nail mark, combined with absence of extensive multiple defensive marks suggests 1. The victim attempted some defense. 2. The defense was brief or unsuccessful. 3. Incapacitation occurred relatively quickly. 4. The victim did not engage in prolonged or vigorous resistance. Why this matters? A 6-year-old victim with an already applied garrote would be unable to mount sustained resistance. The pressure would quickly compromise consciousness. The presence of a single defensive mark suggests initial awareness of the ligature, brief attempt at defense, rapid progression to incapacitation as consciousness compromised, minimal time for extended struggle. Part 8. Consciousness and defensive capacity. Neurological timeline. Understanding the defensive mark requires considering the neurological effects of neck compression. Timeline of ligature asphyxiation effects. 1. Initial application, 0–10 seconds. Conscious awareness of pressure. Initial defensive response possible. Victim may attempt to get fingers under ligature. Full cognitive capacity for attempted resistance. 2. Sustained compression, 10–30 seconds. Compromised cerebral blood flow. Declining consciousness. Defensive capability declining. Panic giving way to neurological dysfunction. Possible gasping, struggling response, but less coordinated. 3. Loss of consciousness, 30–60 seconds. Severe cerebral hypoxia. Loss of consciousness. Cessation of voluntary defensive movement. Involuntary muscle response. Only brain activity severely compromised. The single defensive mark implication. The presence of one nail mark suggests the victim may have made a brief defensive effort during the initial 10–20 seconds of ligature application before consciousness significantly compromised. The absence of multiple marks suggests no sustained defense after that initial brief attempt. This timeline is consistent with rapid incapacitation of a small child. Brief window for conscious defensive response. Quick loss of consciousness preventing extended struggle. Limited evidence of struggle overall. Twartine, hand position analysis. Where was the defending hand? The location of the mark provides information about hand position during the defensive attempt. Mark location. On the lower left neck, just to the left of the midline, a roughly triangular, parchment-like rust-colored abrasion, which measures 1.5 inches in length, with a maximum width of 0.75 inches. This location suggests mark is on the lower left side of the neck, below the ligature furrow. To the left of the midline, consistent with left hand positioning below and to the left of the ligature, hand positioning. Implication. If the mark was created by the left hand, with fingers attempting to dig upward under the ligature, the hand would be positioned below the ligature on the lower neck throat, to the left of center, with fingers attempting to curl upward and inward, trying to create space under the cord. This suggests the victim was attempting a defensive response with the left hand, possibly because the perpetrator's hands or arms were controlling the right side, or because the victim instinctively used the available free hand for defense. Part 10. Perpetrator control during the mark creation phase. The circumstances under which the mark was created reveal information about perpetrator control. Requirements for mark creation for a defensive nail mark to be created. 1. The victim had enough conscious awareness to attempt defense. 2. The victim had enough physical mobility to raise hand to neck. 3. The perpetrator allowed or couldn't prevent the hand movement. 4. The hand and neck positioning allowed fingernails to contact the skin control implications if the perpetrator had firm bilateral control of the garrote or victim's head, applied sudden overwhelming force, used incapacitation method, stun gun, before the garrote, restrained the victim's arms. Then the victim would have limited ability to create defensive marks. The presence of the mark suggests the perpetrator did not have complete bilateral control of the victim's arms during the initial ligature application, or the mark was created before complete control was established. Part 11. Stun gun hypothesis. Timing of incapacitation. The presence of burn-like marks on JonBenet's body led investigators to consider whether a stun gun was used. Stun gun incapacitation pattern. If a stun gun was used before the garrote was applied, was 1. Stun gun applied. Temporary incapacitation, neuromuscular disruption. 2. Victim unable to mount coordinated defensive response. 3. Garrote applied to already incapacitated victim. 4. Limited defensive capability present. The mark creation problem. If the stun gun was applied before the garrote, the victim would have been partially or fully incapacitated, unable to create vigorous defensive marks. Yet the autopsy shows evidence of at least one defensive mark created while the victim was alive and responsive. Timeline possibility. The nail mark might have been created. 1. Before stun gun application. Brief initial contact, garrote application. 2. During initial struggle, before incapacitation. 3. Creating the mark during this brief conscious period. 4. Then stun gun applied, causing incapacitation. 5. Victim immobilized for extended torture sexual assault phase. This would explain the presence of defensive evidence despite rapid incapacitation, the limited extent of defensive marks, the timeline of different injuries, strangulation, sexual assault, skull fracture. Part 12. Alternative mark interpretation, hand positioning and applied force. An alternative interpretation of the upward pointing mark considers how it might have been created differently. Perpetrator hand application. What if the mark was not created by the victim's defensive fingernails, but by the perpetrator's hand position during garrote application? If the perpetrator applied the garrote from behind, used their left hand to apply upward pressure under the chin, pressed upward on the lower neck-jaw area to maximize compression. The perpetrator's fingernails or hand created the mark. Then the apex superior mark would reflect. The perpetrator's hand position during the attack. Upward pressure being applied under the jaw. Deliberate control technique to maximize airway compression. Professional or experienced application of the garrote. This interpretation would indicate the mark was created by the perpetrator, not the victim. The attack was controlled and deliberate. Knowledge of optimal garroting technique. Competent execution of the ligature application. Source 13. Comparative struggle analysis. What limited marks indicate. The comparative absence of extensive defensive marks is forensically significant. Expected defensive evidence in forcible strangulation. Typical victims of forcible strangulation show multiple nail marks on the neck from attempting to dislodge the ligature, scratches on the chest or shoulders, hand injuries from grasping or struggling, bruises indicating physical resistance, evidence of prolonged struggle. JonBenet's limited defensive evidence. The autopsy shows 1 major abrasion mark, triangular, apex superior, limited additional scratching, hands found overhead, not defensive position, minimal evidence of struggling, relatively clean struggle without extensive trauma. Implications. Limited defensive evidence suggests 1. Rapid incapacitation before sustained defense possible. 2. Possible prior incapacitation, stun gun, other method, limiting defensive capability. Victim in physically compromised state, asleep drugged during initial attack. 4. Perpetrator able to maintain control despite any defensive attempt. 5. Brief window for conscious defensive response. Part 14. Developmental physiological factors, child-victim defensive capacity. A critical factor. Distinguishing this case is that the victim was a 6-year-old child. Physiological realities of child asphyxiation. A child victim has smaller neck circumference, easier to compress completely, has less muscle mass and strength for resistance, loses consciousness more rapidly with cerebral hypoxia, has less physical capability for sustained defense, would exhaust defensive capacity very quickly. Expected pattern for child victim. For a 6-year-old under ligature attack. 1. Initial awareness and brief panic response. 2. Attempt to dislodge ligature. Would be ineffective given limited strength. 3. Rapid consciousness compromise. 4. Quick loss of resistance. Capability 5. Relatively brief struggle before incapacitation. The autopsy evidence of limited defensive marks is entirely consistent with the expected pattern for a young child victim who would lose consciousness rapidly and be unable to mount sustained resistance. Part 15. Mark orientation as perpetrator knowledge indicator. The question of whether the mark was created by victim defense or perpetrator hand positioning has implications for perpetrator knowledge. Victim defensive mark scenario. Indicates victim was conscious and attempting defense. Perpetrator allowed sufficient mobility for defensive attempt. Perpetrator did not have complete control of victim's arms. Less sophisticated application of the ligature attack. Perpetrator application mark scenario. Indicates precise hand positioning during garrote. Perpetrator applied deliberate, controlled pressure. Knowledge of optimal garroting technique. Indicates more experienced or deliberate execution. Suggests possible prior knowledge or experience with such attacks. Investigative significance. If the mark reflects perpetrator positioning rather than victim defense, it would indicate deliberate, methodical attack. Knowledge of ligature application mechanics. Controlled execution rather than opportunistic violence. Possible prior planning or experience. Conclusion. What the upward nail mark reveals about the attack. The triangular abrasion with apex superior orientation on JonBenet's lower left neck provides forensic information about the attack's mechanics. Key interpretive points. 1. Direction significance. The upward orientation indicates either victim defensive fingernail gouging, attempting to get under the ligature, or perpetrator hand positioning, applying upward pressure under the jaw. 2. Brief struggle evidence. The presence of one mark combined with absence of extensive defensive scratching indicates brief consciousness, followed by rapid incapacitation. 3. Victim defensive capacity. The limited defensive evidence is consistent with expected response of a 6-year-old child victim who would lose consciousness rapidly under bilateral neck compression. 4. Control assertion. Whether victim created or perpetrator created, the mark indicates the attack was controlled enough that specific, directed trauma resulted, not chaotic, violent flailing. 5. Incapacitation timing. The mark was ante-mortem, created while victim alive and bleeding, suggesting it occurred during the initial phase of ligature application, before complete consciousness loss. 6. Perpetrator technique. If the mark reflects perpetrator positioning, it indicates knowledge of garroting mechanics and deliberate, controlled application rather than opportunistic violence. The upward nail mark is forensically significant, not as evidence of prolonged, desperate struggle, but as evidence of either a brief victim defensive attempt before rapid incapacitation or deliberate perpetrator control. Technique. Both consistent with a relatively quick, controlled attack on a young victim by someone who was able to rapidly overwhelm her defensive capability.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. I'll jump in here. So far we've been talking about the sort of the autopsy and the triangular mark on JonBenet, sort of like with the point facing upward. And this kind of gives us information about how the ligature was placed or applied in her situation. And so the speculation goes around. Well, I'm not really sure it's speculation, but I think some pathologists sort of indicate that JonBenet was trying to sort of get her fingers under the rope to sort of try to pull it away. She was at least trying to do that much. And if that is the case, then the perpetrator was deliberately trying to work against that. It's not that, and that would mean that it's not that, oh, it was a mistake, I was caught up in this, fantasy. I'm not making fun of you. I mean, you believe what you want to believe, but I don't think it was that. Could be, whatever. I'm not the authority. I'm just saying I don't think. If this is the case, I don't think it was that. But she's trying to get her fingers under the rope to pull it away. The sort of perpetrator, this intruder, is like directly trying to counteract that. But we see a limited number of defensive wounds, which might suggest that the struggle was brief before the unconsciousness set in. And that's what I've said before. I think that JonBenet was in a position with this person to where this was not something that was on and off, that was toggled on and off. I think that I think it happened so fast that she didn't have any time to think. The person was allowed to get close to her. The person was allowed to apply this and implement it in a way that she maybe felt unthreatened by it. And of course, if we're thinking about along the lines of the intruder and JonBenet somehow knows this person or is listening because this person's an adult or what have you, and just allows this person, whatever it is, I don't think this person went back and forth because of the limited amount of defensive wounds here. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you start to kind of work down into it. And you're like, well, if we think about this and we also include this, then JonBenet, she did some fighting, but she didn't do much fighting. And like, it wasn't like she had a chance to get at them. I have this up because I never noticed this, and maybe you won't notice this, and maybe you'll tell me this is bullcrap, but I was watching, and I told you guys, Lifetime, that Lifetime did this show. I guess it was Lifetime. It's called JonBenet's Mother, Victim, or Killer. And it's about an hour and 21 minutes. I think some cases they split it up into 2 hours. But on it, one of the pathologists had brought up the point that JonBenet had defensive wounds. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've heard that before, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just sitting there watching. And I said, in my mind, I'm like, yo, that's an old wives' tale. They're just kind of saying that, with no proof. So I can't really talk about it. But they put the pictures up and mentioned it and showed it. And this is the picture that they put up. And so it doesn't look like much now, right? You got to really strain your eyes to look. But what they're talking about is sort of like a crescent, like a little moon shape, right? Like a half moon shape, like if your, I guess if your thumbnail was like this, right? If your thumbnail was like that. So if she was trying to do like this and to get it out, and she tried. And if the rope is here, if the rope is here, she went here. And so it's hard to see. I tried to zoom in as much as possible, but it's hard to see. But it's kind of like this little, and you could probably see it on camera as I outline it. You see the little thumb right here. If you're looking at the little thumb and the pointer finger, then that's where it's at. It's at the top of that, sort of right here. And if I take it away, you probably see that red mark right here. Is what they're talking about, this defensive wound. Not all this down here. Right here, this little right here is red. And it looks just like a red outline, like an abrasion of some sort. But when you look at it closer, it looks like there is a more fine printed thumbnail in there. And so I tried to zoom in a little bit closer. This is probably harder to see. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. But I tried to zoom in a little bit more for you to see. Maybe you can see that. And you can kind of see the moon shape here. But this is what he mentioned on the documentary. The pathologist mentioned on the documentary was this part. Now, it's possible that I see some other bruising or some other marks down here, but I think his main point was this. And I was like, well, dang. I mean, if the pathologist is saying it, I gotta go with it, or I gotta at least, think about it. I try to stick with what they're saying, and I try to stick with what some of the legal documents are saying. I try to use some sort of discernment. So at least if I'm not going to go with it, I at least use it as a talking point. But this was interesting to me because there's not a lot of, it's just like one, as you can see, it's one. So that means that as JonBenet was, whatever happened, it happened fast, it happened quick, and JonBenet goes back and she's trying to do whatever, and then she tries to go under. And she's sort of, it seems like, disoriented to where she can't lock under there and get it off. And so there's I say that because what happened fast. It didn't seem like there was any time for a push and pull or a loose and a tight and loose and a tight. It seemed like it happened very fast, so fast that within the 30-45 second time span that you have before consciousness fades, that's all you got. And I understand that, but I want you to think about that. There's a very grim reality. 30-45 seconds you got before consciousness fades. JonBenet did not have any chance really to defend herself. She didn't really have a chance to defend herself. She had those 45 seconds in which she was caught off guard, and then she's trying to get under her jaw or chin line, and this is what it is. One, not a lot of going back and forth, not a lot of fighting. Just, I try to stick in, and because this imprint, I wonder how deep it is, because that would tell me because the cord is up here, but her finger went down here. So that tells me, it seems to indicate to me that she had to be pretty disoriented to miss by that much, because you know where you're going. When you're trying to get there, you know where you're going. I'm going right here. It's right here. I'm trying to grab it. I'm trying to put. It's right here. But when you go here and it's up here, that might indicate that I'm already losing it. And I'm losing it in a way that I'm disoriented already. And that tells me that the onset was so fast before she could even like react. This was a last ditch effort, I believe, to try to break the seal of it. Because make no mistake, this is tight. This is tight. Whoever did that, I'm dug their heels in. And I wonder if the disorientation included a little bit of elevation, where JonBenet at times was slightly off of her feet, to where it made it difficult. Because I wonder why she can't just turn around. That might, with the tightness of this, it might not alleviate, but I would think that you would try to turn around and face, and maybe she did. But you remember, this rope is only 17 inches, if I remember correctly. It's only 17 inches. And so that's like, yo, if you wrap your hand around it a couple times, like, I mean, you're right up on the person. You know what I mean? So you know that they're not doing well. To be quite frank, you can hear the guttural sounds. You gotta be a person, and that's why I say, whoever did this had a problem with JonBenet. You gotta be, yo, you really gotta have it in you to be doing something like this, hearing the guttural sounds and sticking with your guns. Because that's what happened here. The guttural sounds are coming and this person is sticking with it. Hey, yo, I mean, I think you might be, I think you might be doing a lot right now. If somebody was there, they could say, yo, I think you might be doing a lot right now. I think maybe just let her down. Let her go. She don't look too good, bro. But apparently there was nobody to break it up. And so I do wonder if at some point she was suspended, maybe back to back with whoever this was, suspended up in a way to where she didn't have much control, which contributed to sort of this disorientation of I'm just trying to, get myself under control. And the only thing I have left is this one thing. You know what I mean? So like JonBenet didn't put up much of a fight. She put up somewhat of and it wasn't even a fight against the other person. It was a defensive wound sort of against herself. You know what I mean? To try to help herself out. But, I think she was so disoriented that, she just kind of missed the mark. And I'm not sure that it would have helped as tight as this was. I'm not sure, getting her fingers on it as far as she was along in the process. I don't think that would have helped anyway. Because there's the person that did this seemed quite intentional on. So when we look back at the intruder theory, and we think about that, with respect, we think about this with respect to the intruder theory, it seems pretty intentional. And not that and it doesn't seem like the intruder, wanted JonBenet to leave the house, to be honest with you. It seems like if this is what the intruders did, if this was the intruders doing, then it seems as if the intruder meant to do this. So that ransom note is null and void. They never meant to take JonBenet out of the home. They did what they meant to do. And that was come in, take care of JonBenet, and leave. Well, you said you don't have a problem with John. Why would you do this to John's daughter? Unless you got a problem with JonBenet. Well, who would have a problem with a 6-year-old? I mean, I don't know nobody who has a problem with a child except another child. Do you? Do you know of anybody that has a problem with a child other than another child? I'm just waiting for you, because I'm trying to think of a scenario. I'm really trying to think of a scenario. I can't think of a scenario where an adult has a legitimate issue with a child. There are some, but we know how those turn out. Those are straightforward. Those turn out with the child being put in a compromising position. And in some cases, the child passes away. So it's very clear. And I think some would say that, oh, well, this would lend itself well to PDI. Patsy did it. They would say that, this lends itself very well because this would indicate an adult having, an issue with a child. And so, I mean, in this particular instance, I don't think I would argue against that. For this specific thing, when you're looking through possibilities, absolutely. That could be a case. I mean, there's many other things to consider, as people have pointed out, of course. But if you just take this at face value, I think that you might have a point, a starting point of some sort. But yeah, let me know what you think. Because as I look at this stuff, I try to tighten it up a little bit more. And there's, like I said before, there's so much chaos around. It's so much frantic energy around this. It's very frantic energy, very very frantic, very, very shocked, very overwhelmed energy around this. And it just might be the case that things are not always what they seem. No matter what, and I'm telling you, because it's just how humans behave. Humans do some crazy stuff. Humans will do some crazy stuff. And you'll be like, man, how did that happen? They got into a mindset and that was it. Something happened. They ain't like it. And it's not that they framed it as, oh, I intend to do this. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's framed as, you're a problem. I got to get rid of the problem. And the way to get rid of the problem is this. And that might mean, and I don't necessarily think of it this way, but that might mean, that it doesn't work out for the other individual. I guess that's what I'll say. And I'll leave it there. But Till next time, take it easy.